You will recall a video in which I talked about the shifting of the Overton window with respect to male and female relations and simply calling out certain phenomena that otherwise, in previous times, would have been unspeakable. Talking about female personality traits, about hypergamy is probably the big one. People in semi-mainstream outlets now use the word hypergamy without hesitation, without shrinking away from it, whereas 10 years ago, people would deny hypergamy is even a thing. And consequently, that women were in fact hypergamous, and that their mating strategy was distinct from the mating strategy of men. Now that's just kind of commonplace. People will talk about it, they talk about hypergamy, they explain it, and it has become, at least as a term, less stigmatized. However, there are still things that as of yet have not yet come to light, until now, oddly enough, in the mainstream. I'm not talking about the underground, in the hushed whispers of manospherian circles or elsewhere. I'm talking about the mainstream. With respect to that, I'm specifically talking about Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson, I don't need to explain who he is. You know who he is. Says something in a recent podcast with two individuals that kind of floored me. Not for the content. I was familiar with the content for quite some time, i.e. what he said. I largely agree with him on this, although there's some slight differences. But the fact that he said it. So before we proceed, I think it's very important that we listen to what the illustrious Dr. Peterson has to say. And once we do that, let's talk about the massive shift in the Overton window that this represents.
So I have a question for you, a deeper question, Ricky. And so this is a horrible question. I don't think anybody's ever raised it. So I am not convinced that higher education institutions, and maybe institutions in general, why should we be convinced that they can survive if females run them? And I'm not saying they can't, but I'm going to present the counter argument just for the sake of getting myself in all sorts of trouble. Here's what I see happening. I mean, first of all, or what may be happening, childless women infantilize other people because they don't have an infant. And so female administrators infantilize their students, female professors infantilize their graduate students. They use that fundamental impetus to protect. They misuse it and misapply it. Now, that's well-documented proclivity in the clinical literature. The psychoanalysts documented that, starting with Freud. That's the devouring mother, fundamentally. So, and then we have no historical data suggesting that women, as such, can organize large-scale social institutions because, as the feminists themselves have claimed forever, they were either not doing that or excluded from it forever. And it may be naive to assume that that's just something that women can do, even though that's, as I said, there's no historical precedent for it. Now, I did research in 2016 before I had to fold up my research enterprise entirely. We were looking at what predicted authoritarian politically correct beliefs, and we did a very careful job. The first thing we did was analyze political beliefs to see if there were a collection of coherent beliefs that you could identify as authoritarian politically correct, and there clearly was. So it's not just a right-wing conspiracy theory that such a complex of ideas exists. And then we looked at what predicted the proclivity to believe in those ideas. And the first predictor was low verbal intelligence. And it was a walloping predictor. It predicted politically correct authoritarianism better than general cognitive ability predicts grades. So that was quite shocking to us. But the next best predictor was being female. And the next best predictor was having a feminine temperament. And so, all that together makes up a pretty damn brutal story. And so both of you said that, you're very much hoping to reach out to women. And fair enough. And obviously there are women like Ricky who adopt viewpoints that aren't totalitarian compassionate, let's say. But something's very strange in higher academia and in our institutions overall. And I think toxic femininity is a very much under-discussed phenomenon.
Okay, what do you think? Pretty mind-blowing. Now again, this is not news to most of us. Many of us have thought this about women and their influence on institutions for quite some time. But what is new is that a guy like Dr. Peterson, as he likes to refer to himself, actually had the gumption and frankly the balls to say this publicly, basically to state what is painfully obvious and patently obvious to many of us, that yeah, men and women are very different in their temperaments, very different in their psychologies, and women being increasingly overrepresented, if not massively overrepresented, in academic institutions and more broadly institutions across the board, will inevitably have some kind of effect on those institutions. Whether you perceive this effect as negative or positive depends, of course, in which camp you fall. So, for example, if you are a fan of suppression of free speech, suppression of research, denying the truth, of the doctrine of harm avoidance above discovering the truth and understanding how things actually work, then this is fantastic, and we want as many women as possible in these institutions. But if you have a different point of view, such as you think that science should be about understanding things and discovering the truth of mechanisms, that people should be able to say what they want to say and express themselves, even if those views or opinions are controversial, if you don't believe in microtransgressions, then you're probably not going to think that the wide-scale rulership of women in these institutions is beneficial in some sense. So it really depends on which camp you fall into. And I'm going to hazard a guess here that many of us, myself included, probably don't favor the former and are much more in favor of the latter in terms of how institutions ought to be run. Now, to be fair, Jordan Peterson is probably more willing to talk about certain topics than many people are. He is in his own right a bit fringe. Because he's a multimillionaire, he kind of has FU money. He can kind of sort of say what he wants to say. He's still, generally speaking, well within the Overton window, and generally speaking, he toes the line. He doesn't say anything outrageous typically. But this is probably the most controversial thing he's ever said. It belongs to the realm of the unspeakable, at least in theory. And I don't think that a lot of people are going to catch on or acknowledge it. And if you check out the interview, and I'll post a link in the low bar for it, you'll notice that there's a general acknowledgement that the toothpaste is out of the tube. Yes, I know all these people say you should have done this, you could have done this. It doesn't matter. What are we going to do now? Are the gender demographics at universities and higher institutions more broadly going to change anytime soon? Well, probably not. The current trajectory would suggest the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to see crazy skews of something along the lines of maybe 70% female and 30% male, which I think is going to push things to the point where people need to acknowledge this. You know, it's kind of like you might be worried about the weather, but when there's a typhoon or a tidal wave that's going to arrive at your doorstep in the next couple of days, you tend to pay attention more, you tend to take action. And so let's say we actually do arrive at the point where there's something like 70% females on average at American universities, 30% males, or even 75% females or 25% males. That's going to be very hard to ignore and very hard not to notice. When something of this nature becomes impossible not to notice, something probably will happen in terms of reactions. Now, if we continue down the line of the university industrial complex, and the universities don't really care ultimately where they get their money from, there's a huge financial incentive to just keep things running and rolling as they have been for decades and decades, irrespective of the ideology, irrespective of the skewed gender ratio. But eventually it might also serve as a wake-up call. Because the problem ultimately here with respect to female psychology is, in the sciences, because women overwhelmingly prefer the motto of harm reduction, to give a charitable interpretation of what they're interested in, they're more invested in the moral qualities of their research than their actual research and the results of the research. You could see eventually, and I think we're already seeing it now to be perfectly frank, wide-scale dysfunction at the level of universities. And ultimately, what people want at the end of the day is results. You don't want biochemists and geneticists to not be doing the things they're supposed to be doing because of fear of consequences that are viewed as morally inappropriate. You want them to get at the truth. You want them to understand the underlying mechanisms of whatever it is that they're doing. And although I'm not entirely convinced that that will be the case, I think there is some evidence to suggest that human beings in general will lean towards that because of profit motives. Science in general needs to work in order to make a profit off of it. You can't just create fuzzy fantasies and expect that's going to make money. So maybe long term, and this is over decades, this trend possibly could get reversed if people pay attention enough. But as with so many of these things, there's going to be a lot of pain before that. We're already in a painful situation as it stands now. The question is, how long will it take until people come to their senses? And that's impossible to answer. Again, let's not go to the past of what should have been done, what could have been done. We exist here and now. People didn't think that there would be wide-sweeping consequences to having women in positions of power in academia and other institutions, in the culture more broadly. And as they say in German, now we have the salad, which means we're stuck with it right now. And so the only glimmer of hope here is to wait it out. I think it is a good thing if men continue to not attend university, because that's the only way people are going to notice these things. If there weren't already a gender skew, and people barely notice that, what's going to happen if it's a 30-70, a 25-75? Then people are really going to have to pay attention. And maybe, just maybe, at the end of the day, they will be forced to invest in the males of their society instead of overwhelmingly giving women every form of aid, every form of support, unquestionably, calling nothing into question, and viewing women's presence in these institutions as an unalloyed good, as opposed to viewing it with a dose of realism, implying that, yes, women are cognitively capable. They're basically more or less cognitively the same as men. That's what the research shows, with differences at the tail ends, obviously. There are more male idiots and more male geniuses. Setting that aside, we're talking about the psychological differences, the inclinations versus cognitive ability. And so if you want results and you want things to get done and you want to fix the institutions of certain ideologies, people are going to have to start thinking of these questions. How long that will take, as I said, nobody knows. But I will say the fact that Jordan Peterson, who obviously is a well-known guy, is willing to say things like this is a big deal. And who knows, maybe there will be other conversations. At the end of the day, even though conversations don't do much, that's all we can have. That's all we can have is conversations. And so the more people become aware of these things, the better it is. And I, for one, am pleased that this is getting out into the mainstream, finally. Now, there are other areas like the entertainment industry where women have had a profound effect too. That's going to be a separate video. I plan on covering that separately. But I just think this is remarkable. And ultimately, this is a wait-and-see game. The toothpaste is out of the tube. We can't get it back in. So we're going to have to be patient. Anyway, as always, thank you for tuning in. Many special thanks to my patrons. You guys are the best. You keep the channel alive and going. Without you, the channel would cease to exist. Same to my PayPal donors. And as for everyone else, if you can leave a comment, subscribe, share, like the video. I've been told purportedly that this helps out with the algorithm. Who knows in my case? I have no idea. Until the next time, may the gods watch over you. If I'm still alive, I'll check you out then. Bye-bye for now. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.